Session 21, February 3rd, 1974. Good evening, sports. Never mind, cats will be cats. The drawing is very good. There were 3 beds in that room. Dick slept in one, the bed that you have pictured. His eldest sister slept in another, and a young brother in the third. There was also a smaller bed in which a maid slept. The family was not rich by any means. The maid was a relative of Throckmorton's. In the beginning, she worked for the family to save a decent dowry. However, she was no beauty, and Throckmorton never really managed to pay her much above food and lodging. She also contracted diphtheria and died at the age of 17. She was the daughter of Throckmorton's half-sister. You know her in this life as a relative of, I believe, a niece of your mother's. You will recall that your mother, your present mother, was Dick's eldest sister during that life. The early death of the maid during that existence has overshadowed her present circumstances in her particular case. Because of her death at 17, she finds difficulty in adjusting to womanhood, though she was a female during her brief English life. Nevertheless, she was not able, or is not able, to bear children this time. Rob asked, "In what year did my brother Dick die?" "During that life." They said, Dick was born in 1671 and died at the age of 9. Patricia was the maid, died 2 years later. Approximately 5 years after this, the oldest sister went to France. First to a small town outside of Paris, and then to Paris, where she lived with French relatives. In this capacity, she saved a dowry, working for a very short time for friends of these relatives, and adding these earnings to the goods given to her by her father. As I mentioned earlier, she did marry a cavalry officer and bore him many children. There were windows on the other side of the room. That is, apparently in your vision, you saw the side of the room away from the street. Ralph said, "That's right." They said these windows were not open, however, except in periods of stifling heat, which can seldom in England. This room was the front room and not as spacious as your sketch would make it appear. The mattress was straw, but the bed itself was the best bed in the family, handed down from Throckmorton's father. Throckmorton and his wife Lacy usually slept in it. It was given over to Dick because of his illness. The top coverlet was an heirloom from Lacy's family. Outside of the room, there was a rickety staircase. On the other side of the staircase was a much smaller room where Throckmorton and Lacy slept during Dick's illness with a younger boy who was 3 at the time. The stairs led downward to the shop. Behind the shop was another room that served as a kitchen, and you might say parlor. In any case, it was the family's social room. Behind this was a storeroom with earthen floor and a shed. An imbecile boy sometimes did errands for Throckmorton about the shop. He slept in the shade. Lacy had already had and loved 4 children. One actually lived to be 18 and was born when Lacy was very young. The others died in childbirth or in the first year. Throckmorton had wanted a son to carry on his shop. The child who died at 18 would have been such a boy, and Throckmorton never really recovered from the lad's death. He died incidentally of pneumonia, took sick, and died within 3 days. A marriage had already been planned between this boy, whose name was Dilton, and the daughter of another shopkeeper. Throckmorton resented the fact that his eldest was a daughter, and it was for this reason that she was allowed to make the journey to France. She was 23 and unmarried, since her parents had not married her off, and as she was somewhat of a strain on the family income. Throckmorton gave her a cash settlement. Lacy gave her goods, garments, material, and some jewelry, and the parents bid the eldest goodbye. Much love was bestowed upon the boy, Dick, and at his death, Throckmorton was all the more bitter against his eldest child. Nor was there any love lost on the young woman's part. She was temperamentally different from the other members of the family. The house was filled with mourning when Dick died. The 3-year-old boy lived into old age, turning into a prosperous tradesman dealing in wools and textiles. I am unable at present to tell you what Throckmorton's shop actually dealt with. As I mentioned earlier, the sign out front was of a wooden spoon. The maid, or poor relative, was attached strongly to the boy who survived Dick. She never married and did not live to see womanhood. At times, I will return to this material. The son who did survive, you do not know in your present existence. Throckmorton, however, is your present father. One of the side chores he has taken upon himself is to do reparation to the eldest daughter, obviously taking her as his wife in this existence. However, she holds strong resentment against him from that earlier treatment. They were drawn to each other because of those previous ties, and yet in that past life this daughter was extremely cruel, partly in speech, to Throckmorton, sensing, of course, the bitterness that he felt because she was not a boy. Incidentally, this is a strong subconscious motive. This caused her to bear him 3 sons to help allay his bitterness. She gave him these 3 sons as a gift or sacrifice, and when it seemed he would not accept them as such, she turned against him, made too much of the sons to pay him back. The relative who is now your mother's niece contributed to some degree to the unrest in the previous family as it existed in England. The young relative was very jealous of the older daughter for her position in the family and for the dowry which was hers. Her clothes were hand-me-downs from the daughter of the family, and since the maid was quite a few years younger than the daughter, the clothes fit her poorly. She was glad to see the distinction between the father and the daughter. This time the present personality of the maid tries to make up for the jealousy and for many quarrels that she initiated secretly between Throckmorton and his daughter, by malicious tattling and playing one member of the family against the other. I suggest you take a brief break, if this material hasn't already broke you up. You made a witty and somewhat frivolous comment. My dear Joseph, during your lengthy period of rest, I shall lead you to understand human nature to a better degree than before. If women feel like murdering their husbands or lovers, if men found themselves occasionally amazed, alternating between feelings of sexual love, paternal affection, and even boyish pride, as far as their own wives are concerned. Now you can see why these feelings are so natural and inevitable. The reason that Dick has had the same father twice is simply that he died at such a young age, before the relationship could be worked out between the two. Dick's wife was also alive in England during Dick's short life. She was the daughter of a baker who lived across the street, and was one of the boys' playmates. The two children were very fond of each other, both with warm and sunny dispositions. They were attracted to each other at that time, and renewed their relationship in this existence. I may add here that they chose to renew this relationship, that is, free will operating in this case as in all others. There are always varieties of personal problems to be worked out, but the time, place, and relationship is left to choice. For that matter, a personality can choose to ignore the problems completely, though this is at best a cowardly solution and simply holds the personality back. There is very much detail involved here. Needless to say, Throckmorton could have tried to make reparation to his daughter in a variety of ways, and not necessarily by being her husband. There was a choice also on her part, that is, they chose to be reborn at approximately the same time, so that their ages made them contemporaries. In many cases, such as this, one or the other with a longer period of time, being born as a child to the other party. These things fit together very tightly. They are interwoven and yet loosely applied. These questions are worked out by entities between lives, and each entity has many problems to consider. In your technological age, such problems are easier to solve than in the past. That is, contemporaries even from different continents can meet in a simpler fashion. The basic problems are necessarily kept from the personality by the entity, simply because so many psychological undercurrents would sweep the ego off its feet and pull the rug of sanity from beneath it. In some instances, this happens despite the personality's attempt to hide the weight of the past. Also, on many occasions, the personality escapes the problems entirely. What happens here is that the subconscious communicates with the entity through the inner senses, to the effect that the present personality is not strong enough to handle the problem. The personality then changes course in midstream. Some, but not all, cases of insanity represent the personality's inability to handle a particular problem, while at the same time it refuses to obey the orders from the inner senses to change course. On such occasions, data from past lives rushes up or through the inner senses. The personality is no longer capable of shielding itself from this material when it goes beyond a certain point. That is, the personality is now working against itself. Some controls are still present. These struggle desperately to distort the past data, clothing it in all sorts of ideal camouflages and fantasy. In this case, insanity is actually a protective mechanism, in that the personality will face almost complete disorientation rather than confront truths in its past that bring up problems it cannot solve. At the same time, such a personality will not let go either and will not change course. The dilemma is therefore a dire crisis. I will give a brief sample. If you do not mind me using your own present family. Ralph said, go ahead. Say said, if your mother or father found continued life together completely unbearable, which incidentally they do not, then in all likelihood one of their entities would suggest through the inner senses that the relationship be discontinued. If the advice was not heeded, and as the situation grew worse, a danger point would arise beyond which the personalities could not safely continue their association. After this point was passed, and all inner warnings went unheeded, then, to one or another, little by little, or perhaps in flashes, clear pictures from the past would rush to the personality who was no longer strong enough to hold them back. Almost instantly, the present ego of the personality concerned would set up countermeasures against what it would consider an invasion. The past's inner data would be turned into delusions, fantasies, and so forth. I suggest you take a break. I am never sure really if my analogies help matters or not, but here is another. If it will make things easier for you, you can think in terms of the entity and the brain and a mind. The entity in this case would be compared to the mind. The brain would be more or less what it is. That is, the brain of the present personality existing on a camouflaged plane. As the brain gives orders and communications messages to the various parts of the physical body, so would the mind or entity do in like manner. The mind would contain all data having to do with past existences and intertwining purposes, problems, and relationships, but it would only give such data to the brain as was necessary for its present existence. That is the analogy. In actuality, the mind is but a portion of the entity which ducks out for the personality on the camouflage plane. Your guardian angel, legends, and such refer to this part of the entity, which is the mind and which is attached to the present personality during this particular existence. The mind helps to keep the personality from going too far astray. I use the term personality to include the whole person. I use it to express the entirety manifested in physical form in one life. The mind, as I mentioned earlier, is part of the inner plane. It is a mere portion of the entity itself. Ralph asked, is it possible for us to contact our own entities? Say said, you are silly sometimes, Joseph. For shame. From the information you have been given before and from the above paragraph, you should know that you are in contact with your own entities, in that the mind is a portion of the entity to begin with. I have told you that communication between a present personality and the entity is carried on by means of the inner senses, and I have told you that in these sessions you use the inner senses. Surely, then the question answers itself. Also, in a very real sense, taking the above into consideration, you are your own entities, though in operation consciously on this particular plane only. In many dreams, you talk to yourself, so to speak. That's a pun. Don't miss it. Ralph said, we get it. They said, in your visions, you are in contact with your entity. Your entity is merely a part of yourself with which you are not completely familiar. Ralph said, I guess that's what I had in mind. They said, I made a remark. After sessions, I am afraid to Ruber one evening. I couldn't resist to the effect that you would both be better off if you would think in terms of your entities. Do not think of your entities as a foreign alien individuals ready to gobble you up. Even though I speak jokingly of assimilating my poor Frank Watts, this is not the case at all. If I may make a comment, your eager, bungling friend was an acquaintance in your immediately past lives, making late contact with you now. He was a sort of educated medicine man in those days, peddling many potions supposed to arouse erotic passions in weak and fainting Victorian ladies. He had 7 children, a wife of almost obscene girth, and a child called Stephen, who was a pharmacist or doctor. His name was Creighton III. He knew you both slightly. You came in contact with him at various times. His wife, Giovanna, that is not Giovanna the city, Geneveva, came to Ruber to contact a dead brother. Genevieve was wealthy, upright, and homely. Your friend was 4 years younger than she, 5 times poorer, and 10 times more ambitious. They married over the objection of her family. He actually had a small pharmacy which he ran himself in Boston. On the side, he sold whatever merchandise idiotic men and women would buy to secure lovers. Behind the respectable scenes, such concern was high, and many a good churchgoer let minutes in the front door while they collected bottles supposedly filled to the brim with flash incentives in hidden back rooms. He died in 1863, fat, widowed, and fairly prosperous. He choked to death on a prune pit. Since he was short of breath and fairly portly and filled with gout, this isn't as silly as it sounds. He was 82 or 83. He should watch his drinking habits closely in this life, as he has a predisposition toward gout, and drinking to excess can lead in this direction. And I don't care what your doctors say. He merely moved in a circle, the outer circle, of your acquaintance at that time. There is no reason in particular why you met him this time, except for this sense of familiarity. It does not follow, in other words, that everyone with which you are concerned involved themselves with you in past lives. You always meet completely new and different personalities in various existences, as well as old ones. Many times, in fact, you solve problems that arise with certain personalities by helping other personalities in other lives. There are laws of a sort that govern these matters, but you can mark my words. In one way or another, all debts are paid. These so-called debts are actually challenges to the particular personalities involved. The word debt implies guilt, and such a connotation is not my intention. The sense of original sin, however, which unfortunately has been made so much of, is undoubtedly in part an inner recognition of debts of this sort, hanging over the personality at birth. But, again, there is no guilt in the terms usually applied to that word. I suggest you take a break, though I have to admit that the entry of your late friend just about has me all broken up. I believe that you are far enough along so that you could work with an observer present, providing the observer was someone with whom you felt comfortable. This is as you wish. That is, it makes no difference to me. If Ruber becomes uncomfortable, then of course you would not have a good session. Since I make no effort to control Ruber in any way, I have no idea how he would react. If the observer was someone you both trusted, the fear of failure would not enter in so strongly. I tried to tell you both that your friend was welcome to stay, but could not get through the strong conscious static at your end. Frank was dear inquisitive Joseph is resting and he needs it. You are right in supposing that I run after him, grabbing his short tail, so to speak, in our beginning sessions, and yet, you see, it was easier for him to make contact for me in the beginning than it was for me to do it myself. He was simply more open to your plan. There are many things, naturally, that I have not explained to you simply because of the time involved on your part. Needless to say, there is great fluidity and variety and challenge on the part of personalities and personality fragments. There is great give and take, here as in all other matters. I will go into this further at a later date. I'm not squinching Frank was. I am sure he appreciates your concern. There is much involved here in the matter of personality fragments and of particular personalities, and it is too late for me to begin a discussion in that. No potentiality is ever ignored, but given full opportunity to use its abilities. Not only does such a potential depend upon inherent abilities, but also upon a facility to use energy and to gather it together in one field as a unit. Upon this depends, to a large extent, the strength of any sort of a fragment, and this ability, as much as any other, is a limiting factor also. This is a matter into which we have not yet gone. It is nevertheless important, and one of the basics with which some of our later sessions will be concerned. It is this ability which is ever a strong force on your plan, having to do with the building up of particular elements, atoms, neurons, and so forth, into camouflage patterns. On your plane, you must use this organizing ability to form the camouflage pattern. There are planes with much similar camouflage patterns, and some inhabited by personalities too weak or limited in this ability, and others inhabited by personalities strong in this ability to use energy, but who no longer need to use it in such a camouflage pattern. Do you want to take a break? I mention this for Joseph because his fingers seemed cramped. In any case, I believe we will close tonight's session. I am tempted to carry you further along the lines which we have just begun. However, I do not feel it would be a good idea so late in the session. You will see that we have covered a good bit of material here, and I certainly hope I have set Joseph right as far as Frank is concerned. Ralph said, "Yes, I worry about him." She said, "You needn't. He is doing very well for himself. And now, dear friend, good night. I will of course continue the session if you want me to. Sleepy time is no crime. Now I am no point and you know it. Yes, good night, yes.